Welcome everyone to Truth Nation. Bill Bodner here with the Chief, Mark Garrett. No shoulder sling, Chief.
I had to take it off for this. It's just too bulky, and now you can see how my right arm is like half the size of my left arm. Just,
Yeah,
anyway.
yeah. Hey, I've been there. As we were talking before we went on, I had both shoulders done. One, 6 years ago? One 5 years ago? 4 years ago?
Oh,
And it's a long recovery, but I worked out good for me. Worthwhile. I'm glad I did it. So it's good to see you up and about, recovering. You didn't get bit by the dragon, the oxycodone dragon, so you're still coherent. And
no.
yeah, good.
No. Fortunately, that stuff wears off. Like, take it a couple of times, and the effects, like as far as pain reduction or making me sleepy or whatever, they kind of wear off pretty quick. So I don't have any interest in it other than like I gotta take it right now because it's killing me.
Right.
But so I'm lucky that way.
Right. Good to hear. Hey, today's show, Ukraine, obviously in the news. I mean, it's been in the news for the past couple of years. I feel like as I started hearing about the work that the president's doing to try to reach some kind of resolution to it, some kind of peace treaty, the narrative that I heard from the media was interesting. And I said, hey, let me do some research. They're saying these things about Russia, about why this war started. Let me do some research and see if I find anything different. And I actually did find a lot of different stuff that, hey, it's out there now. It's becoming more mainstream. A gentleman named John Mearsheimer, a very prominent professor at the University of Chicago, an expert on international relations, been on the Lex Friedman podcast, huge podcast. And I think one of the things he talked about there a little bit was Ukraine. He has a very different point of view. And although, just to be clear, I'm certainly not a Russian apologist, Mark, and I don't think you are either, or a Russian sympathizer. And I recognize that one country invaded another. Russia invaded Ukraine. They, in essence, started this war, and they are ultimately responsible for what's developed since. But there were, at the very least, you'd have to say there were warning signals. I guess at best, you would say there were warning signals that this was going to happen, that we were going down this road. And at worst, I think you would say that U.S. policy, U.S. foreign policy under a number of different presidents, and I can go all the way back to George Bush Jr., George Bush II, back in 2000, took actions or put forth U.S. foreign policies that almost created the situation where this happened, or could I say where this had to happen, or they may have, maybe a better way to describe it, Mark, is they may have forced Russia's hand by some of the foreign policy things. And it's interesting, as we go through it and as we talk about it today, one thing that struck my mind about it is some of the people that have been involved in politics for the longest seem to grasp and hold on to almost the Cold War mentality or the Cold War threat. And hey, I remember when I worked at DEA, whenever you wanted, the thing that you're working on to be the big thing, or if there's a big threat out there, you want to be working on that big threat. Why? Because you get the resources if you're working on that big threat. So I wonder how much of what has happened over the past, 20 years almost, Mark, with Ukraine and Russia, how much of it is the fault of our intel community almost keeping this threat on life support to remain relevant in their, if you're at CIA and you're working the Russia threat, if that threat goes away, you're irrelevant. You don't have a job, you're unimportant. And I think as I looked through this, I wasn't looking to find that issue, but I thought, man, it sounds a little bit like they almost made a threat out of Russia that, almost went away with the fall of the USSR. And they wanted to keep that threat alive, to keep justifying these intel budgets and all the work they were doing. But as we go through it, Mark, I don't know, maybe hearing from you, I'll change my mind on that. But it's one thing that struck my mind. So what I would say is, what my hypothesis is now, or what I believe now, is that the U.S. and our allies did play a role in the creation of the circumstance that led to this war. and that the traditional belief that's out there in the media that it's an attempt by Putin to reunify the old Soviet Union, that it's Putin the conqueror trying to recreate a superpower, the old Soviet superpower, to bring it back. Maybe tangentially has something to do with it because there are relationships with Ukraine and all these other former Soviet Union countries. But my first question for you is out of the gate is, what was your mindset before you took this topic on? And do you see it now from maybe a little bit of point of view, or what's your thought on this narrative before we get into the details, this narrative that the media has been putting out there that no, all this is Putin trying to reconquer and kind of restart or reunite the old Soviet Union?
Well, Bill, one of a number of important things you touched on here is the Cold War in general, and under that umbrella, there are a lot of different aspects to how we got here we can talk about. But going specifically to my mindset, when Russia initially invaded Ukraine, my mindset was it's Putin. He wants to expand Russia. He wants to fold Ukraine back into a pseudo, Eastern Bloc country. He's, fanatic. It's territorial. He wants to rebuild the Soviet Union, if not by name, in effect. And I was adamantly, a supporter of Ukraine, winning this war. Now, of course, what winning this war looks like, and I'm sure we'll get into this. I mean, nobody can really define on either side, whether it's Russia or Ukraine at this point. What does winning actually look like? But to really explain, my mindset, and this is what you talked about, the Cold War, Bill. I got a couple of years on you, and I remember every Friday morning in elementary school at 10 a.m. the alarms went off citywide in Los Angeles. And what do? We did the duck and cover drill.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because we were kind of, at the height or near the height in the late 60s, early 70s of nuclear confrontation, or at least the possibility thereof with the Soviet Union. And this wasn't, look, the Soviet Union, we come out of Korea. We were in the middle of Vietnam. These were all either direct or proxy wars, certainly proxy wars, I guess, with the Soviet Union. These things were real, they were tangible, and they were understandably frightening to everybody. So what I call, my initial reaction, my initial position about the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, I call it Cold War hangover.
Yep.
And, there was this emotional things like, oh, it's Russia, aka the Soviet Union. And in my mind, I'm still living in 1970, or for that matter, 1980 or 1985, a lot of us. And you articulated this, Bill. You talked about these policymakers or these people in these think tanks that were kind of the same thing. They're my age or even older, and it kind of living under that mindset. And I think it's two things. Especially for these people who are quote unquote experts, which I don't put a lot of value in, but we'll just, for the sake of, discussion here, the people who know the ins out of foreign relations, of military strategy, economic sanctions, things like this. It's twofold. It's policy and experience driven, but it's also emotionally driven, like it was for me when the invasion first took place. And I got to tell you this, like you said, Bill, there's no way, you're right, that neither of us are an apologist for Vladimir Putin. We can talk about the evils of Vladimir Putin, from now until when the cows come home. But that's separate from what's actually going on, I think, right now with this war. But this was something that a dear friend of mine, who almost from day one, actually, even during the buildup of the Russian forces near the Ukrainian border, a good friend of mine, I consider him a mentor. He's a few years older than me. We've known each other for almost 50 years now. And he said, Mark, they are dumping all this on Putin when the responsibility lies elsewhere. And we can get into this, but he was X, Y, Z, why we got to this point. Mm-hmm. And I just dismissed it, Bill. I mean, I got to honestly, yeah, whatever. Putin has no business doing this for whatever reason. But over time, this dear friend of mine, he stayed on me. We had conversation after conversation after conversation. And slowly but surely, this Cold War hangover that I suffered from, I think, the ice began to melt. And I start taking the emotion out of it and start to try to analyze things. And when I start doing my research, then and for today's podcast, it really, I won't say occurred to me, but over time, it became apparent to me that the blame outside of the actual physical invasion lies elsewhere, not on Putin's shoulder. And I may be hated for that, Bill, because a lot of people in my otherwise conservative camp on so many issues think that I'm a Putin apologist, and nothing could be further from the truth.
It's amazing, Mark, that we're on exactly the same page with this. Exactly the same page. Like, I feel the exact same way. And I love that term that you came up with, Cold War hangover. I mean, it's almost, and you especially see it with some of the older politicians who have been around since the 80s. And, it's the Russian threat, and they're still thinking that way when, maybe that threat, I guess, it's one of those things where we're addressing the last threat instead of looking at what the next one is, which is just a general complaint I probably have about, how our intel community works. Starting with the timeline, I mean, going all the way back to 2000. So in 2000, and I guess this would be Clinton, prior to the election, prior to the 2000 election, Putin asked Clinton about actually joining NATO, about becoming a part of NATO. And Clinton wouldn't go for it. And then supposedly I don't know if you'd say agreement, verbal agreement, whatever it was, Putin then said that, okay, but can you promise us that none of the countries on our border will become NATO countries? And again, this is 25 years ago. And supposedly the answer is yes, of course. In 2008, Obama comes in and Putin again says, hey, I'd like to explore joining NATO. And again, he says, no, that's not going to happen. And, at that time, Putin says, hey, there were several other countries, I guess Clinton promised that these other countries, Lithuania, Estonia, they were not supposed to join NATO, and they eventually did join NATO. And I think at that time, so this is, what is that, Mark? 16 years ago? 16, 17 years ago?
Yeah.
Putin said, if Ukraine joins NATO, there's going to be serious problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a long time ago to say something like that and have it kind of be ignored, or have people refuse to acknowledge that may be one of the reasons or a part of why we ended up where we're at. Mm-hmm. And in 2008, so I guess this is still while Bush is president, they invite Putin to Bucharest to a NATO summit. And what happens at this summit? They announced that Georgia and Ukraine would eventually become NATO members. And I think the assessment was by the intel community was that Russia was too weak to fight this, and it would go through, and there would be no issue. Now, obviously, Mark, Russia was immediately outraged by this and made it clear that it wouldn't accept Georgia or Ukraine joining NATO. And I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but I think one of the things that was fascinating about this time, Mark, is who voted against these countries coming into NATO back then. It was Germany and France, right? Because they were afraid of what Putin's reaction would be. And in 2008, Putin also said, if Ukraine joins NATO, it will do it without Crimea and without its eastern regions. And if you look at 2014, what happened? 2022, what happened? I mean, he was telling people back in 2008 what he was going to do. William Burns, in 2008, the ambassador to Russia, and later became the director of the CIA. And another, again, interesting, Mark, that even in 2008 or post 2008, we're still seeing the Russian threat as so prominent in the intel world that the gentleman who was the ambassador to Russia is tasked with running the CIA. He wrote a letter or a memo to Condoleezza Rice that said Ukraine entering NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. He also said literally every contact he had in Russia said that Ukraine joining NATO was a direct challenge to Russian interest, and he said Russia would respond. Now, this is our trusted ambassador that's on the ground there saying if this happens, there's going to be an issue. So, back at that time, it seems like that was just totally discounted, totally ignored.
Yes, it was.
And do you feel like that's something just because they had intel that they're thinking, no, it's a bluff, Russia's not going to do anything? What do you, I guess the fact that it's just totally ignored and basically they become almost a de facto NATO member, which I'll get into. Although again, Germany and France voted against this because they saw the potential issue and were afraid of, being in, Western Europe, they were afraid of the actions Putin would take. Is that where the U.S. first missed the mark or the first, warning signal about this?
No, I don't think it's the first place they missed the mark. I think it's one of the most important places they missed the mark because, like you said, Bill, that Putin said it. He didn't hide his intentions, based on Ukraine's status with NATO. He made it very public. He made it very clear. Your question about, did they take it seriously or why didn't they? It's a great question. There's so much contradiction on the part of, decision makers and diplomats, elected officials when it comes to Russia and Putin, like over the time frame you're talking about. In other words, well, if Ukraine joins NATO, really Russia is too weak to do anything about it. But at the same time, the justification for bringing NATO and theoretically other countries, bringing Ukraine and theoretically other countries into NATO was because of the enormous threat that Russia still posed. So they're playing both sides of the coin here. And we can get into, a lot of issues. We can go back to Eisenhower with the, military industrial complex and what motivations are there with, in other words, keeping these endless wars or these endless threats of wars to keep the machinery being built and things like this. And again, it's probably a different day, different topic, but it's certainly related to what we're talking about here. Your quote there from that individual is very good. I actually have one here that bolsters what you're talking about, Bill. And this is from the publications, the Australian Outlook. And this was from just under a year ago, July of 2024. And within this article, this is not the author, this is someone they're quoting. His name is George Kennan. Now, George Kennan worked in the Truman administration. He worked in the Kennedy administration. Both, of course, Truman and Kennedy were staunch anti-communists. They were, obviously Kennedy it was in World War II in the Pacific, but still fought against this aggression. Of course, we had Vice President at the time and Truman at the very end of World War II dealing with the Soviets. But so Kennan had been a part of administrations and he was an advisor and was expert. But let me read a quote from him. George Kennan, intellectual architect of the Cold War containment doctrine, a former ambassador to the USSR and one of America's wisest students of Russian affairs, spoke for the many dissenters in 1997 when he warned that NATO expansion would be the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. It would weaken Russian reformers, embolden hardliners, undermine strategic arms agreements, and escalate East-West tensions with Russia when Russia got back on its feet and began acting like a great power. I mean, this guy was prophetic. By the way, he lived to be 101 years old. He died in 2005. Before a lot of this came to fruition. But the reason I bring him up is because, again, this relates to what you're talking about, kind of in the intro, Bill, about the Cold War and these elected officials or, decision makers, these players that really lived and worked through the Cold War. Where here's a guy, by the way, I don't know much else about him. I found this quote and I thought it was perfect, to illustrate, what we're talking about and where the responsibility of this war really, really lies historically. So he was immersed in this. He was doing what he could to defeat the old Soviet Union, which he certainly was a part of the collapse of the Soviet Union. But did he went on to say the last thing we should do now is expand NATO? And I think he was prophetic, and I think he was 100% right.
Yeah, and even, I have the quote here from the Chancellor of Germany. They went back, and I think it was Angela Merkel. Does that name sound right?
Yes, sir.
They went back and asked her, because again, at this Bucharest Summit in 2008, she did not support this. And the quote from her was, she said she knew Putin would consider that a declaration of war back in 2008. Now, the Bush administration pressured France and Germany to kind of go along with this. And although the Ukraine wasn't brought into NATO at that time, there was a public pronouncement that Georgia and Ukraine would eventually join the NATO alliance, right? And what happened 4 months after that? The Russo-Georgia War. So Russia went to war with Georgia. Now, there had been issues there where I guess separatists who were, ethnic Russians, tried to secede from Georgia. And, there was already political issues there. But as these skirmishes increased and Georgia started trying to crack down on these groups, Putin and the Russians said, well, listen, you're going to crack down on these pro-Russian groups in your country and you want to join NATO? I mean, we're going to support those groups. And basically, conflict started there, right? A war started there just on this threat or on this idea that Georgia was going to join NATO back in 2008. So there's kind of like, I don't know, a precedent. Like he said, this is what's going to happen. And in this case, it actually did happen. The U.S. continued to go forward with the NATO push even after that, right?
Yep.
So I don't know, Mark, 2014, I think there was an uprising in Ukraine. And I don't know if this was something where U.S. aid, so to speak, might have been involved in this change in government, but there was a pro-Russian prime minister named Viktor Yanukovych, and he ended up fleeing the country. He was out. He was replaced by a pro-American prime minister, and really, it seems like that was one of the instigating factors. Like, okay, the Ukraine is going to join NATO, and now they've kind of ousted this pro-Russian guy in Ukraine and replaced him with someone loyal, more pro-American,
pro-Western,
pro-Western. That's a good way of putting it. Russia took Crimea. And kind of this,
just like Putin said he would,
right? And helped fuel this civil war in the Donbass region. So, I mean, I didn't really find too much, Mark, and I'm wondering if you did, about this kind of, I don't know what you would call it, overthrow, not really overthrow of the government, but whatever it was, whatever activity took place, this uprising that caused Yanukovych to flee the country. And I'm wondering, is there any evidence like where that came from, or were Western powers involved in kind of instigating that, in your opinion, and putting in someone more friendly to the Western alliance? Because Yanukovych was certainly more on the pro-Russian side.
Yes, he was. Going back a year before that, there were huge protests in 2013 as well. And those protests, from, my research, those were kind of predicated on, there was initially this decision, or this movement to become part of the EU, with Ukraine becoming part of the EU, sorry. And for whatever reasons, that plan kind of fell apart, and there were protests about that. So
Mark, there were protests about the plan falling apart, or about the plan?
Yes.
Okay, about the
plan falling apart.
Okay.
And I think, and now again, I'm kind of making, connecting the dots here. In other words, these protesters blamed Russian pressure for the plan falling apart. not coming to fruition about joining the EU. And again, it may have been Russian pressure. I don't know, but I think this was. And by the way, that the president, I mean, this guy was in and out, and Parliament put him in and took him out for years before 2014. So there was a lot of unrest and instability, internally with Ukraine, before the fateful February 2014 Palestinian invasion. And so the likely, your question was, did the U.S., did Western forces, play a part in removing him and planting in somebody who was pro-Western, pro-U.S.? Possibly. Would either of us be surprised? Absolutely not. Has the U.S. done that over and over and over throughout the world? Of course. And so why would we be surprised? But all of this is part, I think in Putin's mind, it's all part of the bigger picture. We can say a lot of things about Putin that are true and that are evil, but one thing no one can call him is a dummy.
Yeah.
The guy is very, 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 very bright. He's very bright. He's very, very cagey. And he plays a long game. He can see down the road. And so when you see something like this happen, say, wait a minute. They just ousted my guy, and now they're putting somebody in here who's pro-Western. They want to, have Ukraine part of NATO. I mean, these things are massive. And I want to talk about, when the time's right, in the show today, Bill, I want to talk about these same types of circumstances as they might relate and have related to the U.S. in the past. In other words, having foreign powers at our borders and how we react.
Yep. I want to do that too. I see that same thing. So after 2014, when that invasion happened, between 2014 and 22, it seems like the U.S. and the allies kind of made Ukraine a de facto NATO country. They were training 10,000 troops a year. In 2017, Trump sent Ukraine defensive weapons. So again, this isn't just, one president. We've seen, the steps that Bush took, the steps that Obama took, and now the steps that Trump took with training and sending defensive weapons there. There were also joint military exercises. And interestingly, in 2019, Zelinsky was elected. I think that's when he was elected in Ukraine. And his platform at the time was kind of working with Russia to resolve the conflict. It wasn't really, pro-American, pro-Western. That was not really until Biden found himself in the White House. And again, I think, so let's talk about it like this. So when Biden came into office, there was definitely a more hardlined approach toward Russia. And, what is that from? It could be that thing we're talking about, Mark, that the Cold War hangover, where he's a guy that's been in politics for how many years? 60 years? So for, a long portion.
By the way, for longer than he can remember.
Right, that's definitely true. For a long portion of his career, the Russia threat was the huge threat, the Cold War, etc. So he, under Obama, he kind of handled that region. He had that portfolio with Ukraine, as we know, right? He started with a real hardline approach toward Moscow, and Zelinsky started shutting down pro-Russian TV shows and media in Ukraine.
Right.
He arrested a close friend of Putin and charged him with treason. I'm sure that probably didn't sit well. And there was, in early 21, after the inauguration, there was this renewed enthusiasm for pushing Ukraine into NATO. And like I said, I think this is just kind of the old school political thinking. So one of the things that I think pushed it maybe over the top was July of 21, Ukraine and U.S. hosted a training operation in the Black Sea, and there was 30 countries participating in it, like one of those big show of force training missions. It was called Rapid Trident 21. And I think the quote that was released, there was a press release done about this. The quote that came out, and it was designed to enhance interoperability with allied and partner nations to show units are ready. That's basically that basically means Ukraine is a NATO nation. if we're training with them, if we're sharing weapons with them. I mean, doesn't that kind of mean, Mark, that de facto, although they haven't been, formally signed the deal to become a NATO nation, aren't they in essence a NATO nation at that point?
Yes, I would think so, Bill. Effectively speaking, look, at the very least, they would be considered a strategic asset to the United States. In other words, I want to put this in practical terms. Okay, NATO, and what does all that mean? Specifically, and by definition. But as it relates to Russia, as it relates to Putin, what it means, okay, this country now on my border is now an active military and economic ally of a historic, at least, adversary. And so again, right or wrong, I don't care how evil the person is or how bad they are. I'm just talking about what is the perspective of someone who now fears that they have an ally of the greatest military power on earth at their border. I think any of us can see that someone would be concerned under those circumstances, especially given the 80-year history since World War II of the two countries.
Yeah. And, interesting, in July of 21, there was an article that Putin himself wrote that was published on Russia-Ukraine relations. And in that, he kind of famously said, "Do you want to establish a state of your own? You're welcome to. How should Russia treat Ukraine? There is only one answer: with respect. What Ukraine will be is up to its citizens to decide." And his posture at that time seems to not be one of, we are going to conquer and take over Ukraine. It seems to be one of, we don't want the West to install basically a puppet government there. We don't want Ukraine to become an arm of the West immediately on our border.
Yeah. By the way, Bill, and I'm so glad you read that quote. And I'm not sure if it's from the same article. I think it is, but either way, and I'm paraphrasing here, but most of the media is using this quote from Putin, where Putin says, again, I'm paraphrasing, that the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of all time was the fall of the Soviet Union. And I'm paraphrasing, but it was the worst thing that could have happened, but whatever. And he longs emotionally for the return of the Soviet Union, and that's where he stopped.
Right.
But what he says next is, that's never going to happen.
Right.
That's never going to happen. It's not in his desire. In other words, he's talking about, hey, that's literally what I grew up in, and I missed the old Soviet Union, mainly because he was in the KGB, and he was a privileged citizen of the Soviet Union. He had it very, very good, almost as good as he has it now. But the point is, practically speaking, is that that's never going to happen. We live in a different world now. Russia is a different country than the Soviet Union. There's a free market aspect to it. That's never going to go away. He likes it personally, by the way, and it's good for Russia. So, coupled with what you quoted, it doesn't seem like he ever had these aspirations about, going through and creating a new Eastern Bloc. And you said it very, very well. Hey, listen, run your own country, be successful, thrive, but don't be an ally to an historic adversary.
Yep. I think I found that quote you're talking about, Mark. Let me know if this is one.
Oh, good. You can clean it up for me.
Putin said, "Whoever doesn't miss the old Soviet Union has no heart. Whoever wants it back has no brain."
Boy, look, see, whether you're doing off the top of your head or finding a quote, you always clean me up. You go from 90 seconds to 5 seconds and much clearer.
Yeah. So
that's exactly right.
Yeah. So that's kind of the landscape in 2021. I mean, NATO had a summit in Brussels that year, and they issued a statement again that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And that statement said, "We reaffirm all elements of that 2008 decision," right? Or the 2008 proclamation that was made that Ukraine would eventually become a NATO member. They said
the same one that included Georgia as well.
Correct.
In 2008.
Correct. Yeah. And a couple months later, Zelinsky visited the White House in September of 21 where Biden made it clear that the U.S. was fully committed to Ukraine's, let's call it Euro-Atlantic aspirations. In other words, becoming more involved in the EU and westernizing Ukraine, becoming more friendly to the West, and in both, and economically, I can see where that would make sense. Now, in November 10th of 21, the U.S. and Ukraine signed a charter on a strategic partnership. And I think probably within, I don't know, a month of that happening, or maybe it was already ongoing, Putin started to surge troops to the Russia-Ukraine border. And that's what you talked about, as your friend said, hey, here's what's going on with that. They started kind of building up the troops on the border as a show of force and kind of a reminder that, hey, we said we couldn't tolerate this. If this is the direction that you're going, this is what you can look forward to. And then one of the final things was in December 21, December 17th, Russia sent letters to NATO and Biden demanding, one, a written guarantee that Ukraine would not join NATO, and two, no offensive weapons would be stationed near Russia's border, and three, NATO troops and equipment that were moved into Eastern Europe since 97 would be moved back to the West. Now, that's, that's an interesting list of three demands. That with respect to that third one, troops and equipment moved into Eastern Europe since 97 need to be moved back. I don't know. Maybe you want to put something in there to give yourself negotiation room, right?
Yeah, right. Exactly. Okay, they can stay if you do X, Y, Z.
Right, but I mean, they made it pretty clear, and that was both the United States and to NATO. Here's what we have to see. And 4 days later, he said, and again, this is a quote: "What they are doing in Ukraine," and this is where, Mark, we're going to get into some of those things you want to talk about. What they're doing in Ukraine is not happening thousands of miles from our border. It's on the doorstep of our house. And Tony Blinken's response, he was our Secretary of State at that time, was, there's no change and there will be no change. In other words, we're going forward with this plan. Mark, am I crazy to draw a comparison between this and 1962, the United States?
Just wrote it down.
Yeah, 1962, the same two players, United States and Russia, the roles reversed. There's missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from the coast of the United States, on the doorstep of our house. And Kennedy says, what does he say? What does he say, Mark? You take it over.
You remove the missiles from Cuba or else. And Kennedy did it. In other words, it was a completely tangible way because he sent our Navy, into the Caribbean and blockaded Cuba.
Right.
And it's, if your ships come, they're going to be sunk, and these are the terms. And who knows what he was saying on the Red Line to, that would have been Khrushchev at the time, I believe.
No, Khrushchev. Yeah, Khrushchev.
No, Khrushchev, I believe. Yeah. And so that's what he said. So in other words, there was no negotiation here. Now, by the way, and you've actually brought up a minute ago about, Putin's, the three demands in the letter that he wrote in 2021. And there were negotiations behind the scene. And one of the concessions the U.S. made in 1962 was to remove tactical nuclear weapons. I believe it was from, I'm forgetting the country now, but we actually removed, I think it was, come back to me in a minute, but we actually removed some tactical nuclear weapons in exchange for the Soviets removing the nuclear weapons from Cuba and never going back in that sense again. So, and this takes me to the next part here. But you're not crazy. I think it's a very, very, matter of fact, when you think about it, Bill, Cuba is 90 miles off the free state of Florida, in which I live now. It's 90 miles away. Russia and Ukraine share a border. It's not 90 miles. Right. It's 90 inches. And so this whole goes back, Kennedy was acting on, and again, I'm trying to stay focused here on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, obviously. But we want to be objective, whether it's our friend or foe, how we react, things like this. And I don't know if you're going to talk about this, Bill, but I think it's so important because you actually brought up the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is absolutely perfect. So it's the Monroe Doctrine. And if you want to run with this,
No, go
feel
ahead.
free,
Go ahead.
because but the Monroe Doctrine. Now, this goes back to President Monroe, 1823. He made a speech to Congress and talking about the U.S. Foreign policy framework in the Western Hemisphere. Moving forward from that date on, and how the framework would really affect relations with some of these new independent countries in Latin America. In other words, these countries are blossoming. They're new countries. They're going to attract activity. They're going to attract partners, and we better be their partner, not a foreign nation, especially. And they were talking specifically about Europeans. So, and I'll read this to you. So, Monroe Doctrine is a U.S. foreign policy framework addressing America's security and commercial interests in the Western Hemisphere. It emerged from 3 paragraphs in President James Monroe's annual address before the U.S. Congress in December 2nd, 1823. The doctrine addresses how the United States would conduct foreign relations with new independent nations in Central and South America, and how to curb European ambitions in Western Hemisphere territories. Now, why is this so important and why is it so closely related to Ukraine and Russia right now? Now, remember, this is 1823 when President Monroe is making this address to Congress and laid out this framework for really kind of pretty much where we are now with our doctrine in the Western Hemisphere. Mm-hmm. This is only really it's 30 years after the Revolutionary War. So what do? We got out from under the thumb of a tyrannical king. And who was our enemy? And by the way, and right after the War of 1812, where Britain invaded our now United States. So this was the mindset. We can't have these European totalitarian, all-powerful countries come in here and start allying with countries that are on or near to our border and really in our sphere of potential influence, where we can have economic growth and other kind of partnerships. Again, without being apologetic for Putin, why doesn't he have the right to feel the same way about territory around him?
That's a great question. And I actually had that written down here. Is Russia entitled to a similar doctrine? Like, it's now granted, ideologically, it's a different mentality than we have in the United States. I get that. Mm-hmm. But what he's saying is, these Western values, this Western push is trying to align with our neighbor, and we don't want that. The alliance should be with us and must be with us. And I think
or neutral,
exactly. And I think that's a major part of this. And hey, you talk about the blockade around Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I would point to the surging of troops to the Russian border.
Yes.
You talk about Kennedy saying, hey, that the missiles have to go or whatever. And I don't know, what was that quote? From Putin, what they are doing in Ukraine is not happening thousands of miles from our border. It's on the doorstep of our house. I mean, that's pretty strong language saying that it wouldn't be tolerated. So I saw a lot of similarities between those two things. And I thought interesting that, I guess, well, how would you term that? Russia blinked in 1962, or they negotiated, or maybe diplomacy was used in 1962 to avert a nuclear war, or at least a war where perhaps the U.S. invades Cuba, or I don't know what happens. Right. But this time around, it doesn't even sound like if there was an acknowledgement of the differences, there was no diplomacy. It was almost discounted.
I agree, Bill. I think there was certainly a level of arrogance on the part of Western powers here. I think that, one of the things we talk about, the Cold War hangover, and of course, a hangover gives you a headache, makes you sick to the stomach, mm-hmm. maybe not being able to focus as well. The other part of that Cold War hangover is with the collapse of the Soviet Union. In other words, for those of us who lived through a good portion of the Cold War into our adult years, like you and I did, the feeling when the Soviet Union did collapse was not only one of immense
Yep.
relief, because literally I had nightmares as a kid about nuclear
Hmm.
weapons. I really did. I woke up really frightened about nuclear weapons because we were taught it on, all the time. But there was this huge sense of relief, but there was another feeling, and I think this really got in the way of things, leading up to where we are now with Ukraine. There was a sense of, we can beat anybody anytime we want to, one way or another. And now we can do whatever we want. Now, look, there's no larger support, there's no greater supporter of our military and my personal, way before Donald Trump, that America first
Hmm.
mentality, that we have to be successful. We have to win in a moral, ethical way every time we can, in every way that we can. There's no doubt about that. However, if that mentality gets in the way of missing, or causes a missed opportunity for diplomacy, that's a bad thing. And I do think that happened here. In other words, giving a couple of inches here probably would have prevented what we saw in February of 2022.
Yep. And now, looking back now, well, I don't know, 300,000 lives lost or more. It's hard to
Yeah,
even it's
and
hard to even say it.
we don't know for
Yeah, you
sure, but
can't
at
even really
least.
see any estimates really. So February 24th, 2022, Russia invades. And you know what? I have seen reports that so here's one thing I'm not sure of, and it's kind of it could be a significant point, and I'm not clear on it. What the military strategy was, Mark, was the military strategy one of kind of blitzkrieg, storm the country, take over Kiev, occupy, kind of take over the government immediately? Or was it more take over some of the eastern region and hold that and then start negotiating from kind of a point of or a position of strength? Now, I've heard that this, or I've read that this was not a blitzkrieg strategy. And people say, well, that he wasn't trying to take over the country because he didn't just try to storm the country. It was very measured. They went in slow. And in 3 days, they started actually talking about negotiations. The other side of that could be maybe they did attempt a blitzkrieg and they were repelled. And some of the argument I've heard to support that is, listen, NATO had done a good job of training this military. The reason why this military fared so well in those early days was because of the kind of de facto NATO status, all the training, et cetera, et cetera. Any thoughts on that as to the military strategy, what it really was? But and am I correct to say that very shortly into this incursion, there was kind of feelers put out like, hey, let's talk about ending this thing. Let's talk about resolving this now.
Yeah, I'm certainly not a military strategist, but my take on it, when it happened, those first few weeks and couple of months, certainly into the war, Bill, is that Russia was not, and simply is not, a well-oiled military machine.
Hmm.
That's really my bottom line on it. Then they put a little finer point on it. A lot of their equipment is outdated. This one thing I do know, that their supply lines were almost non-existent. It was a horrible, horrible logistical undertaking on their part, completely mismanaged. So they weren't supplying troops to the front line, whether it was food or other personal items, and then munitions, things like this. So that part of it, the supply line part, was absolutely a disaster on the part of the Soviet Union. How old I am, Russia. And of course, when you're the home team, when you're Ukraine, supply lines are much, much less important because you're closer
Hmm.
to your sources. So I think that was the main thing. The other thing is, too, think about this. The Russians specifically, although they have been involved in proxy war after proxy war after proxy war, and then some minor incursions or minor conflicts that they actually had troops involved in, for the most part, unlike the United States, who just, 20-year war in the Middle
Right.
East, Soviet troops didn't have any practical experience with it. Ukraine, obviously they actually did, because they had to mount a lot of forces with, 2014 with Crimea, things like this. And they probably, I think, given their size, they probably stayed pretty well trained up. And this goes to your point about the training from NATO. So I just think that was a poorly planned thing on the part of Soviet, God, I keep saying it, with Russia.
Mhm.
And then once they got in there, they find themselves kind of bogged down, kind of mired down. And, what do we do next? I don't think there was a very clear strategy. And so it became kind of a stalemate, what we're kind of seeing today.
Yeah. So, what one thing I've heard, Mark, and I want to get your thoughts on this because I disagree with it adamantly. I say, people say, well, listen, this is a good thing because Russia is weaker today. Russia is weaker today because of this war, and Russia is less of a threat to the West today. And I almost say the inverse of that is true, Mark, because let's not forget they have nuclear weapons. And
More than we do.
Yeah.
I mean, at least in hard numbers.
and
How effective
if nothing, if you've beaten them down to the extent that their existence is now in question, is it really crazy to say they might resort to something like that?
Listen, it's certainly not crazy. And early on in this war, probably the first year, I was reverting back to my childhood, where I was kind of having at least, daydreaming in a bad way about nuclear attack. I said, God, how bad could this go? I don't know if I'm that concerned today as I was, a couple of years ago about the war in that regard, but it's certainly a possibility. And I agree with you, Bill, about that. No, they're probably not beaten down. Look, Russia doesn't have the greatest economy in the world. Again, I don't think their military is, I don't think that in a conventional situation, they would stand a chance against the United States. Not a chance, over time. However, just like the old days of the Soviet Union, we never thought in terms of a conflict with Soviets in conventional terms. It was only nuclear terms that we thought about conflict.
Mhm.
I don't think anything's different today because, we're not going to send, 500,000 troops over to Eastern Europe, and Russia's not going to send them over here. And we're not going to be fighting on Normandy anymore if a conflict broke out. It's going to be at the very least tactical nuclear weapons or strategic nuclear
Right.
weapons if we ever went toe to toe with the Russians, in my opinion.
And how do you feel about the threat level with them still having nuclear weapons and now being kind of a diminished power?
Well, I think that the worst part about diminished power is, it's a blow to Putin's ego. There's no doubt that how many young men can you lose? Now, the Soviet Union, of course, they can lose a lot more people than Ukraine can.
Yeah.
They're such a large country. We talk about these human statistics, it's just horrible, but it's a fact. But as far as, a threat directly to the United States, this is the reason that we didn't, I think they detonated their first bomb in 1949, the Soviets, the hydrogen bomb in 1949. And from 1949 until 2025, we have not had a nuclear exchange. There have only been two nuclear bombs used in aggression. That's why the U.S. with Japan. There's a reason, because even though I think Putin is an evil person, he's not crazy. He's not delusional. Thank God, like our leaders, they're not crazy or delusional.
Mm-hmm.
No one is going to, quote unquote, win a nuclear war. One side probably is going to be a little more devastated than the other. So I think the fact that, having this somewhat balance of power, it's what's keeping the peace, certainly in a strategic sense. On these tactical senses, these micro battlefields are dealing with, it's a different story. But I don't my biggest concern is not a direct conflict with the Soviet Union. My biggest concern are situations we're seeing right now between Russia and Ukraine. And these things can expand in a conventional way, and that bothers you more than anything else.
Yeah, which kind of brings us to the resolution of this thing. I mean, it seems like that the major issues to be resolved, Crimea, Ukraine wants it back, right? The eastern regions of Ukraine, declared independence from Ukraine back in 2014. Russia supported this. Russia kind of sees these as independent countries. Ukraine wants to regain control of these, while Russia doesn't want to, wants to continue recognizing their independence, border security, and neutrality. So if this thing is to get resolved, Mark, it's not going to be, each side is already a huge loser in this.
Correct.
Each side is
correct.
And so where do you think that the resolution ends up, as far as, and I know it's super hard to thread a needle like that, but what do you think we see?
Well, my guess is, Bill, is that for the most part, there's probably some minimal exception here to my guess, but my guess is the territory that Russia has acquired is not going back to Ukraine. That's my guess. I don't. In other words, it's like you made the point earlier about concessions being made in the 62 Missile Crisis. And by the way, it was Turkey. My memory serves me, where we removed our tactical nuclear weapons in exchange for the Soviets taking their missiles out of Cuba. So there have to be concessions on both parts, on both parties, the part of both parties, to end the conflict. That's just all there is to it. That's why you have something called unconditional surrender, or you have a ceasefire or an armistice, which is more of a compromise and an agreement to end the conflicts about where we are right now. We're going to stop where we are right now. And I think that's just going to happen with this conflict. I don't see, in other words, the concession for Putin is, okay, I won't take all of Ukraine, but I'm keeping what I already took. That's all there is to it. And for Ukraine, the concession is because look, the money now is going to dry up. The money, and for the most part, I think resources are going to begin to dry up from the United States. And so that's going to be a concession. Okay, we can keep our country, most of it, without having to send another 100,000 young men to their deaths, and the Soviets can keep what they have. That's what I think is going to happen. I'm happy to be proven wrong, or not happy to be proven wrong, but I can't see it ending any other way, Bill.
I think you're right on that, Mark. And let me ask you one other question. As far as, I don't know, if we turn back the clock, even if we could, as far as the whole NATO piece, with Ukraine becoming part of NATO, should, if Ukraine independently wants that, right? It's not being pushed by a Western power, et cetera, et cetera. If Ukraine independently wants that, should the U.S. or someone, as Germany and France did in 2008, say, not a good idea for world peace? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. Well, listen, I'll answer it. First of all, Bill, let me just let my core beliefs come out here. Germany and France can kiss my rear end, and for so many reasons. Germany is not interested in world anything. Germany is interested in Germany. And by the way, I'm an America first person. I want Germans to be German first persons, things like that. I totally get that. But my point is this, is that Germany, I'll give you an example. Germany, and this may have changed about a month ago, but Germany is still buying natural gas from Russia through third parties. France is still buying liquid natural gas from Russia. In other words, if they really want to put their money where their mouth is, and they would be engaging every sanction possible, but they're not, because, no, although the world's catching on fire because cows are farting, we're going to keep buying a greenhouse gas from the country who invaded Ukraine, and Ukraine we say we support. You can't have it 19 ways. Right. You have to have one way or another. So when we talk about what Germany and France want, I got to be honest with you, kind of like, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and put that aside because I don't put a lot of faith in their principles, at least right now. Now, if by the way, they were right about this, but they were right for specific selfish reasons that they didn't want to. They have a short memory. I don't blame them. Germany, World War I, World War II, France, World War I, World War II, being invaded or having to pay the price for being the aggressor, especially after World War I, and then a lesser extent after World War II. So I understand that, by the way. By the way, another point I want to make is about Poland. Poland is the one country who, per capita, Poland is the best armed, talk about conventional weapons, best armed, best trained, most potent fighting force in Europe right now, per capita. And the reason is, and they're obviously, they hate anything Russia, because when you look at World War II, poor Poland, they were attacked on all sides by all players, namely the Soviet Union and Germany. So they're the ones that are most fearful. And I totally understand about Putin moving through Ukraine, going into Russia. I understand that. But at least they are somewhat self-sufficient, and they're taking their own personal safety and sovereignty seriously. These other countries, they're trying to play all sides of the coin at once, and I don't have a respect for that. So if Germany and France are saying, hey, no, Ukraine, you shouldn't join NATO, they'd be right there. Why they would do it's a different story, but I would agree with them. If Ukraine wants to join NATO, I would hope that NATO would say no. I would absolutely say no. Got us into this conflict. We don't want to have any more. We'll give a concession to the Soviet Union. And by the way, with the Western alliances as it is, we think, I keep saying Soviet Union with Russia, I think we're strong enough as it is, and we don't need another member right on the border of Russia.
Understood. Yeah. So wrapping it up, Mark, anything else you wanted to hit on?
No, you know what? I wanted to get that dig in there about Germany buying gas from Russia right now. I had to get that in there, but it's not it may seem like a small part of this, but it's not, Bill. It's very, very important. If people could imagine England buying natural resources from Germany in 1943.
Right. When you put it like that, when you put it like that, England buying natural resources from the Nazis during World War II.
Right. So if Russia is so bad, and by the way, Russia in this case, it is a bad thing. But in other words, why aren't you doing everything possible? You could buy natural gas from the United States at about twice the price, but you'd survive.
Right.
But no, they want to save a penny.
Right.
And they're doing this, and they are indirectly supplying Russia with the resources to keep the war going with Ukraine. So that's why I put that in there. I think it's a very, very important thing. Again, not to sound arrogant, but I do think it's important. But how this ends, we'll see. But that's my 2 cents, Bill, on it. And it's very complicated. It shouldn't have ever started. Our current President Trump has a lot on his table now to try to get this resolved. And
it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough to resolve, because it's going to be like we said, both sides have already lost so much that it's really going to be tough to get it resolved. Folks, that wraps it up. There's always more to the story. I think the chief and I agree that U.S. foreign policy did not do Ukraine any favors, kind of setting them up for failure in this situation, really, going back 20, 25 years. If you think differently, and by the way, and we both also say, Russia is the aggressor. We are not Putin apologists. We're just talking about errors made in U.S. foreign policy that kind of led Ukraine down this road of what turns out to be almost self-destruction. Let us know in the comments if you disagree, and we'll see you next time here on Truth Nation. Thanks.